In 1894, a Texas town dug a trench 40 feet long, filled it with oak coals, and barbecued enough beef, mutton, and goat to feed 3,000 people in a single afternoon. There were no menus, no drive-through, just smoke, salt, and men who had been awake for 2 days tending the fire. Today, most Americans think barbecue means a sauce-drowned sandwich in a paper basket. The truth is older and far stranger. Number 17 on this list was a whole animal's head buried in the ground overnight. Number 9 was something your great-grandfather hunted in the woods. And number 1 fed entire counties before a single fast food chain existed. These 25 plates built this country, then the convenience economy buried them. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 long-lost American barbecue plates that fast food killed. Number 25, Owensboro barbecued mutton. Long before brisket became a religion, the soul of Western Kentucky barbecue was sheep. Old ewes, too tough and too old for anything else, were the cheapest meat a farmer could buy. So the pitmasters of Daviess County learned to cook them low over hickory until the strong, gamey meat surrendered into something tender and smoky. They mopped it for hours with a thin black dip made of Worcestershire, vinegar, lemon, and pepper, brushing it on with a literal rag tied to a stick. The mutton came out dark as coal on the outside, pink and rich underneath, served chopped on white bread with a dill pickle and a slice of raw onion. A whole mutton fed a church picnic for pennies a head because nobody else wanted the animal. The Catholic parishes of Owensboro built their summer festivals around it. Today, beyond a handful of stubborn old joints, almost no one in America cooks mutton anymore. We decided sheep was for other countries and forgot that it once anchored an entire region's table. Number 24, burgoo. Walk into any Kentucky barbecue gathering 100 years ago, and a black iron kettle the size of a bathtub was bubbling off to the side. That was burgoo, the stew that turned barbecue scraps into a meal that could feed a multitude. Whatever the pit could not sell or slice went in. Mutton, pork, chicken, sometimes squirrel, or whatever the men shot that morning, simmered for a full day with corn, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, and okra until you could no longer tell where one ingredient ended and the next began. A burgoo master was a respected figure, stirring his kettle with a wooden paddle the size of a canoe oar from before dawn. The longer it cooked, the better it got, thick enough to stand a spoon in by sundown. It cost almost nothing because it was built from leftovers. Yet it carried the smoke of the whole pit in every bowl. It was barbecue's way of wasting nothing, and we let it disappear. Number 23, Brunswick stew. Georgia and Virginia have argued for 2 centuries over who invented it, but everyone agreed on what it was for. Brunswick stew was the thing that made a small amount of barbecue stretch across a hungry crowd. Pulled pork and chicken, sometimes the meat pulled off a smoked hog's head. Simmered slow with lima beans, corn, tomatoes, and a hard slug of black pepper until it thickened into a deep orange-red porridge. The early versions used squirrel and rabbit because that is what a poor man had. By the time it reached the barbecue stands of the rural South, it had become the inseparable companion to a chopped pork plate, ladled out hot beside the meat for a few cents more. It was tangy, smoky, and so filling that a single cup could pass for supper. You will still find it at old line pits, but in most of America it has vanished entirely, replaced by a scoop of factory-made baked beans from a can. Number 22, Carolina hash over rice. This is the plate that defines South Carolina barbecue, and almost nobody outside the state has ever heard of it. When a whole hog was cooked, the head, the organs, and the trimmings did not go in the trash. They went into a cast iron pot with onions and pepper and were cooked down for hours into a thick, savory gravy called hash. It was ladled steaming over a mound of white rice and served right alongside the chopped pork. The flavor was deep and almost beefy, with a richness that came from parts of the animal most modern Americans would never touch. A pig's worth of scraps made gallons of hash, feeding a barbecue crowd for a fraction of the cost of the meat itself. Every county had its own version, some made with liver, some without. It was poverty cooking, elevated to an art form, and outside the Carolinas it has been almost completely forgotten. Number 21, pig snoots. In St. Louis, barbecue meant something the rest of the country could not stomach. The snoot was exactly what it sounds like, the snout of the hog, a cut the packing houses on the city's north side practically gave away. Pitmasters smoked them slow, then crisped them hard over the coals until they puffed and shattered like the world's richest pork chip, chewy in the center, crackling at the edge. Slathered in a thin, sweet-tangy tomato sauce and stacked on white bread, a snoot sandwich was a Friday tradition in working-class neighborhoods for generations. A pound of snoots cost almost nothing because no one with money wanted them. They delivered the deep flavor of pork skin and fat in a form that made tough men weep with happiness. As the meatpacking jobs left St. Louis, the snoot faded with them. A handful of corner stands still fry them. Everywhere else, the snoot is a ghost. Number 20, rib tips. When a butcher trimmed a slab of spare ribs into the neat rectangle restaurants wanted, he cut away a strip of cartilage, meat, and bone, called the rib tip. For decades, that strip was garbage, sold by the bucket for next to nothing. The barbecue men of Chicago's South Side knew better. They smoked those tips in towering aquarium-style glass pits until the cartilage went soft and the meat turned to candy, then chopped them into chunks, doused them in a fierce, sweet-hot sauce, and piled them on white bread with a side of fries. A rib tip plate fed a working man for under $1 in the 1950s and tasted better than the expensive ribs they came from. This was black barbecue, born of the Great Migration, built on the cheapest possible cut. The aquarium pits are nearly gone now, and the chains never bothered to copy it, so the rib tip survives in only a few neighborhoods, unknown to most of the country it fed. Number 19, smoked bologna. Out in Oklahoma, they called it Oklahoma round steak, and they meant it with a straight face. A whole tube of bologna, the cheapest processed meat in the cooler, was scored in a crosshatch, rubbed with spice and smoked for hours alongside the brisket and ribs. The smoke transformed it. The outside firmed into a dark bark, while the inside stayed juicy, picking up a deep hickory flavor that turned a joke meat into something men lined up for. Sliced thick and stacked on white bread with pickles and onions, smoked bologna fed roughnecks and ranch hands who could not afford the brisket but wanted to eat off the same pit. A whole roll cost a couple of dollars and fed a crew. It was barbecue's great equalizer, proof that smoke and time could dignify even the humblest meat. Most of America still thinks bologna belongs in a child's lunchbox and has no idea it was once a proud plate off a real pit. First pattern break. Here is the thing nobody tells you about real American barbecue. It was never about the meat people think of today. For most of this country's history, barbecue was a method for taking the worst, cheapest, toughest parts of an animal, the parts the rich would not eat, and making them not just edible, but glorious. Snouts, heads, organs, old mutton, trimmings, bologna. The fire and the time did the work that money could not. This was the food of people who had almost nothing, cooked in the ground or in iron pits by hands that knew hunger. And it was communal. A barbecue was an event. Whole towns turned out. Politicians won elections by feeding voters from a trench of coals. Then the chains arrived in the 1950s and sold us a faster, smaller, sweeter version in a cardboard box, and we slowly forgot that barbecue was ever anything more than a quick lunch. We did not lose recipes. We lost a way of feeding each other. Number 18. Hot guts. In the German and Czech meat markets of Central Texas, the leftover beef and pork trimmings did not get thrown out. They got stuffed into casings, seasoned hard with black pepper and cayenne, and smoked into a coarse, snappy sausage the locals nicknamed hot guts. When the bite broke the casing, hot fat and pepper hit you all at once. These markets, in towns like Elgin and Taylor, were grocery stores first, and barbecue joints by accident, smoking their meat to preserve it, and selling it by the pound on butcher paper with crackers and raw onion. There were no plates, no forks, no sauce. You ate with your hands standing up. A ring of sausage cost a few cents and carried the full character of the smokehouse. This was the original Texas barbecue, decades before brisket became famous. The old meat markets are mostly closed now, and the cased, peppery hot gut has been crowded off the plate by the brisket it once stood beside as an equal. Number 17. Barbacoa de cabeza. Along the Texas and Mexico border, the most prized barbecue of all came from the part of the cow that scared everyone else, the head. A whole cow's head was wrapped in maguey leaves, or wet burlap, lowered into a pit dug in the earth, covered with coals and dirt, and left to cook overnight in the trapped underground heat. By Sunday morning, the meat fell from the bone in tender, gelatinous strands, the cheeks and tongue richer than any steak. Families pulled the meat, piled it onto warm corn tortillas with cilantro and onion, and ate together after church. A cow's head cost almost nothing at the butcher because no one with options wanted it. This was a feast built entirely on what others discarded, the literal definition of barbecue. Health regulations later made the backyard pit nearly impossible, and the steamed factory version that replaced it is a pale shadow. The true earth pit cabeza is now a rare and dying art. Number 16. Cabrito. When the spring kids came in on the South Texas ranches, the young goats, too small to keep and too many to feed, became the centerpiece of the most celebratory barbecue of the year. A whole cabrito was splayed open on an iron rod and stood up beside a bed of mesquite coals, roasted slowly so the thin meat picked up smoke without drying out. The result was delicate, almost milky, nothing like the strong goat flavor people fear. It was cooked for weddings, baptisms, and any occasion worth marking. A young goat was cheap on a ranch where they were everywhere, which is exactly why it became a feast for working families who could not afford beef. Cabrito remains a point of pride in a few border towns, but across the rest of America, the idea of barbecued goat sounds exotic. Even though it was once a regular Sunday in a huge stretch of this country, the chains never sold it, so most people never met it. Number 15. Pit beef. Baltimore had its own barbecue, and almost no one outside Maryland knows it exists. Pit beef was not smoked low and slow. It was a top-round roast, cooked hot and fast over charcoal, charred black on the outside while staying nearly raw, and red in the center, then sliced paper-thin against the grain. It went on a Kaiser roll with raw white onion and a fierce horseradish sauce called tiger sauce that cleared your sinuses in one bite. Top round was one of the cheapest, leanest cuts a butcher sold, prone to toughness, but slicing it thin across the grain made it tender and stretched a single roast across a whole crowd. Sold from roadside stands and parking lot grills along Pulaski Highway, a pit beef sandwich was blue-collar Baltimore on a plate. It never spread because the chains had already claimed the roast beef sandwich and made it soft and gray. The real, charred, bloody, sinus-burning original stayed local and is barely hanging on. Number 14. Smoked beef Claudie. Before brisket ruled Texas, the cut that fed the masses was the Claude, a massive 17-pound chunk of beef shoulder. It was tougher and far cheaper than the cuts a steakhouse wanted, which is exactly why the barbecue men chose it. They rubbed it with salt and pepper and smoked it for the better part of a day over post oak until the connective tissue melted and the shoulder could be sliced into thick, beefy, smoke-ringed slabs. A single clod fed dozens, making it the backbone of cheap, high-volume barbecue for generations. It demanded patience and a real fire, not a machine. When brisket caught the world's attention and barbecue went upscale, the humble clod got pushed aside. Too big and too unglamorous for the modern plate. A handful of old Central Texas joints still cook it, but the beef shoulder that actually built Texas barbecue is now an answer to a trivia question, rather than something most people have ever tasted. Second pattern break. Here is what the food industry would rather you never connect. Every single plate on this list has the same secret. It took time, and it took a crowd. A pit beef stand, a Carolina hash pot, a trench of barbacoa. All of them required hours of slow fire and a community to eat the result, because a whole hog or a whole beef shoulder is not a meal for one. That was the entire point. Barbecue was the food that pulled people out of their houses and put them around the same smoke. The fast food model could not survive that. There is no profit in a meal that takes 18 hours and feeds the whole street for $1 a head. So they sold us speed. They sold us the individual portion, the sealed wrapper, the drive-through window. And in doing it, they did not just change what we eat. They quietly dismantled the reason barbecue existed, which was never the meat. It was the gathering. Number 13, cracklins. When a hog was butchered and its fat rendered down for lard, the little nuggets of skin and fat left behind in the kettle were not thrown away. Fried hard in their own grease until they puffed and crackled, cracklins were the cook's reward and the children's treat. A savory, shattering bite of pure pork. At a barbecue, the skin pulled off the smoked hog was crisped over the coals and chopped right into the meat, so every bite carried crunch. Down in Cajun country, cracklins were sold by the bag from roadside trucks, salted and spiced, eaten by the handful. They cost nothing because they were the part everyone else discarded. They delivered enormous flavor and the kind of crunch that kept a hand reaching back into the bag. Modern food culture decided fried pork skin was unhealthy and banished it, even as it sold us potato chips by the ton. The homemade cracklin, born straight off the pit, has nearly vanished from the American table. Number 12, Alabama white sauce chicken. In 1925, a pitmaster named Big Bob Gibson in Decatur, Alabama, did something heretical. He smoked whole chickens, then dunked them, smoke and all, into a tank of tangy white sauce made from mayonnaise, vinegar, and black pepper. It sounds wrong and tastes incredible. The cool, sharp sauce cutting straight through the rich smoked bird. Chicken was the cheapest meat a Southern family kept, so smoking it stretched the barbecue dollar further than pork or beef ever could. The white sauce kept the lean meat moist and gave it a flavor found nowhere else in America. For decades, it stayed locked inside one corner of North Alabama, a regional secret passed between pits. Most barbecue lovers in this country have still never tasted it, because the sauce on every grocery shelf is red and sweet, the version the big brands decided we should want. The white sauce, one of barbecue's true original ideas, almost slipped away entirely. Number 11, barbecue spaghetti. In Memphis, a pitmaster looked at his leftover pulled pork and his pot of sauce and did something nobody expected. He tossed them with spaghetti noodles. Barbecue spaghetti was born, smoky pork, and a tangy and sweet sauce clinging to the pasta, served as a side or a whole meal on the same plate as the ribs. It was pure resourcefulness, a way to turn the ends and scraps from a day's smoking into another full dinner that cost almost nothing extra. It fed families and church crowds and stretched a little meat across a lot of plates. For a while, it was everywhere in Memphis, a genuine local institution. But it never traveled because it was too strange for the chains to bottle and too humble for the fancy joints to feature. Outside a few legendary Memphis spots, barbecue spaghetti is now almost unheard of, a brilliant little invention that the rest of the country never got to meet before it started to fade. Number 10. Santa Maria Tri-Tip. On the central coast of California, the ranch cooks had their own barbecue tradition, older than most of the famous southern ones. They cooked over red oak on iron grills cranked up and down over the fire by hand. The cut they made famous was the tri-tip, a triangular piece of the bottom sirloin that butchers everywhere else ground into hamburger because they thought it was worthless. Seasoned with just salt, pepper, and garlic and grilled to a rosy medium rare, it was sliced thin and served with pinquito beans, salsa, and grilled bread at the great communal barbecues the Spanish ranching families had held since the 1800s. A cut that cost almost nothing fed a whole crowd of vaqueros. For over a century, this stayed a strictly local Californian secret. Only recently did the rest of the country even learn the tri-tip existed, and most Americans still have no idea that one of the oldest barbecue traditions on the continent was quietly burning oak out west the whole time. Number 9. Barbecued possum and raccoon. This is the one that makes modern people recoil, and it kept Southern families alive for generations. When money ran out and the smokehouse was bare, a man went into the woods with a dog and came back with a possum, or a coon. The meat was strong and fatty, so it was parboiled first to tame it, then slow-cooked over coals with a heavy mop of vinegar and pepper sauce until it was tender enough to fall apart. Sweet potatoes roasted in the same coals alongside it. It cost nothing but a night of hunting. For poor rural families, black and white alike, across the South and Appalachia, wild game off the pit was not a novelty. It was survival. And a barbecued possum was a real Sunday dinner that brought the family to the table. As grocery stores and refrigeration spread, the practice quietly died, carrying with it a whole branch of American barbecue that fed people when nothing else would. Number 8. Smoked turkey. Long before it became a holiday afterthought from the freezer aisle, a whole turkey on the pit was a genuine event. The big bird was brined, rubbed, and smoked for hours over hickory until the skin turned mahogany and the meat stayed shockingly juicy, threaded through with smoke right down to the bone. A turkey fed far more people than a chicken for not much more cost, which made it the centerpiece of barbecues where a big crowd had to be fed cheaply. The smoke kept the lean meat from drying the way an oven always seemed to. Pitmasters took real pride in it because a properly smoked turkey was harder to nail than a brisket and far easier to ruin. Then the industrial turkey became a once-a-year obligation, boiled down to a dry punchline at Thanksgiving, and the proud smoked bird that once anchored summer barbecues faded out. Most people have never tasted a real one and assume all turkey is dry, which is the saddest part of all. Number 7. Smoked hog jowl. The cheek of the hog was one of the most flavorful pieces on the whole animal, and for most of American history, it was treated like treasure precisely because it was so cheap. Cured and smoked, the jowl was a fattier, richer cousin of bacon, and at a whole hog barbecue, the cheeks were prized scraps the pitmaster often kept for himself. Sliced and crisped over the coals, the jowl delivered an intensity of pork flavor that no lean cut could match. In the rural South, it flavored pots of greens and beans and showed up as a smoky bite all its own. It cost a fraction of what a proper ham did because the head was the part people of means left behind. As Americans grew squeamish about eating from the animal's face, and as factory bacon took over the breakfast table, the smoked jowl slid into obscurity. It became another deeply flavorful deeply frugal piece of barbecue that we abandoned the moment we could afford to. Third pattern break. Here is the quiet truth that ties this entire list together. Nearly everything on it disappeared in the same 30-year window, between roughly 1950 and 1980, the exact years the fast food chain conquered America. That is not a coincidence. The chains did not just sell us hamburgers. They sold us a new idea of what eating was supposed to be: fast, individual, identical in every town, and stripped of any part of the animal that required skill or courage. A pit that fed a whole community from a cheap, ugly cut over 18 hours could not compete with a window that handed you a wrapped sandwich in 90 seconds. So the snoots and the hashes and the burgoo kettles went cold, one town at a time, as the men who knew them died and their children chose the drive-thru. We did not decide this food was bad. We were simply offered something easier, and we took it, and we forgot. The knowledge did not fail us. We walked away from it. Number 6, smoked beef tongue. At the border pits and in the old immigrant butcher shops, the tongue was a delicacy, not a horror. Smoked or cooked down in the pit until tender, then peeled and sliced thin, beef tongue was unbelievably rich and buttery, the most tender meat on the entire animal. Folded into warm tortillas with onion and cilantro, or piled on bread with horseradish, it fed working families for a fraction of the price of a steak, because the average American customer would not touch it. That squeamishness was its blessing, keeping it cheap for the people who knew what they had. Tongue carried the smoke beautifully and rewarded the patient cook with a texture nothing else could match. As supermarket meat got shrink-wrapped and faceless, and Americans lost the stomach for anything that obviously came from a real animal, the tongue vanished from the pit and the plate. A cut that once fed thousands now sits unsold, an embarrassment to a country that forgot how to eat the whole beast. Number 5, Memphis dry ribs. Before sauce drowned everything, Memphis pitmasters cooked ribs naked. A rack of spare ribs, the cheaper and meatier cut, was coated in a thick blanket of dry spice rub, paprika, garlic, pepper, and a dozen guarded secrets, then smoked slow over coals with no sauce at all. The rub formed a savory crust as the fat rendered, and the rib was served exactly as it came off the pit, dusted with another handful of spice. The flavor was all smoke and seasoning and pork, with nothing sweet hiding the meat. This was barbecue with confidence, the kind that did not need to be smothered. Spare ribs were a budget cut compared to the loin, which is why a whole region built its barbecue on them. The dry rib still survives in Memphis, but everywhere else in America, the sticky, sweet, sauce-soaked rib has won so completely that most people have never even tasted what a real dry-rubbed rib is supposed to be. Number 4, Texas beef short ribs. Long before anyone called them dinosaur ribs and charged a fortune, the giant beef rib was poor folks' food. These massive bones, with a thick cap of meat, were too big and too fatty for the steakhouse, so the butcher sold them cheap. Central Texas pitmasters rubbed them in salt and pepper and smoked them for the better part of a day over post oak until the meat went soft as butter and pulled clean off the bone in a single, rich, beefy slab. One rib could feed a grown man twice over. It was the cut that working families and pit crews ate, while the lean, expensive steaks went to people with money. The fat was the whole point, basting the meat as it cooked into something impossibly tender. For decades it was overlooked entirely, almost forgotten, until the modern barbecue boom rediscovered it and slapped a luxury price on it. Most Americans still picture barbecue as a sauce-covered rib basket and have no idea this humble giant ever existed. Number 3, Eastern North Carolina whole hog pulled pork. This is the oldest barbecue in America, the one that started it all, and it is genuinely endangered. A whole hog, split open, was laid over coals and cooked all night, the pitmaster shoveling fresh embers under it and turning it just once near the end. Every part of the animal cooked together, the lean hams and the fatty shoulders and the crispy skin. Then it was all chopped together and dressed with nothing but a thin, fiery sauce of vinegar, salt, and red pepper flakes. No tomato, no sugar, no sweetness to hide behind. Just smoke, pork, and acid, served on a bun or a plate with slaw and hush puppies. A whole hog cooked overnight, fed an entire community for the cost of the animal and a load of wood. It demands a master willing to stay awake all night by a fire, and those masters are dying out. The vinegar whole hog, the true origin of American barbecue, is slipping away as the men who guard it pass on. Number 2. South Carolina mustard barbecue. In the heart of South Carolina, where German immigrants settled in the 1700s, the barbecue sauce turned gold. Instead of tomato or vinegar, they reached for mustard, building a tangy, bright yellow sauce that clung to chopped whole hog pork like nothing else in the country. The locals call it Carolina Gold, and for 2.5 centuries it has stayed almost entirely inside a narrow band of counties, a barbecue tradition hiding in plain sight. The pork was cooked whole and cheap, the way it was everywhere in the Carolinas. But that mustard sauce gave it an identity that no other region could claim. Most Americans, raised on sweet red sauce from a bottle, have never once tasted barbecue dressed in mustard and assume it must be a mistake. It is not. It is one of the oldest and most distinct barbecue traditions on the continent, carried down through families who never let go of the old German taste, and almost nobody outside that small golden corner of the South even knows it is there. Number 1. The Whole Hog Community Pit Barbecue. At the very top of this list is not a single dish, but the event that gave birth to all of them. For more than 200 years, the American barbecue was a gathering. A pit was dug in the ground. A whole hog or a steer or a sheep was lowered over coals, and the men of the town took turns tending the fire through the night, while the women cooked the hash and the burgoo and the slaw. By the next afternoon, the entire community arrived. Neighbors, strangers, politicians chasing votes, rich and poor at the same long plank tables, eating the same chopped meat off the same pit. It cost almost nothing because the labor was shared and the cuts were cheap. It was how this country celebrated independence, won elections, raised churches, and buried its dead. Then the chains taught us to eat alone in our cars, and the great pit went cold across America, one county at a time. We did not just lose a meal. We lost the table that the whole country once sat down at together. Here is my challenge. Cook one of these this week. Just one. The smoked bologna, the Alabama white sauce chicken, the dry rub ribs. Then sit down and share it with somebody, because that was always the point. Tell me in the comments which one you are going to make. And tell me if your family ever cooked one of these on a real pit. I want to know if the smoked turkey gets more love than the rib tips. And I want to know whose grandfather still dug a hole in the ground to feed the whole street. These were never just plates of food. They were the way this country fed itself before we let a drive-through window decide what barbecue was allowed to be.